Charles Malik, the Human Rights Legacy of Lebanon. The event begins with the Lebanese national anthem. Reverend Father Dr. Pierre Najem, President of NDU, Mr. Beirut Sitrakian, President of AGBU, ladies and gentlemen. Few are the Lebanese who have risen to contribute at the international level as Dr. Charles H. Malik did. Malik will forever be remembered as a co-author of arguably the most important international document in the 20th century, namely the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Part of his successful contributions comes from his background as an Easterner who studied in the West. Thus, he himself had aspects of a universal person. This international figure has been underrated both internationally and at home. Today's event aims at highlighting Charles Malik and making his values of freedom better known to the world today. The initiative for today's symposium came from the Armenian Benevolent General Union, AGBU, who knocked at the right door, NDU, where a massive archive of Malik is housed. It is from NDU's archive that the event is being broadcasted. The opening remarks are by President of NDU and by President of AGBU, Father Pierre Najem and Mr. Beirut Sitrakian. The floor is now to a pre-recorded message from Father Pierre Najem, President of NDU.
Ladies and gentlemen, the renowned American sculptor Melvina Hoffman, back in the 1950s, made a bust of Charles Malik, a bust which is cherished by the Malik family. Many decades later, Notre University-Louaize, which in some sense has become Charles Malik's larger family, commissioned its own bust of him to sculptor Pierre and has cherished it on its campus since the bust's inauguration in 2013. Perhaps there is a symbolic indication in this to the fact that Charles Malik at home was spearheaded by NDU. NDU sees itself as Malik's family, partly because NDU treasures a massive archive of his papers. This archive has been systematically publishing works by Malik and works on Malik, as well as running conferences and welcoming researchers. Perhaps more importantly, NDU sees itself as sharing the same values that Charles Malik lived for and promoted all his life. His 1982 book, A Christian Critique of the University, which was co-republished by NDU in 2016, should serve as a handbook to all Christian higher education institutions in the world. NDU is proud that its motto is Gaudium de Veritate, the joy of truth, which reverberates with Malik's outlook of the truth as a given, independent being, fixed and certain, available for discovery, reassuring to reason, and fulfilling to the soul. Besides publishing 2 books by Charles Malik and a book on his philosophical thought, NDU has held 2 international symposia around Malik, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70th anniversary, we held a conference with scholars who flew to NDU from 5 continents: Africa, America, Asia, Australia, and Europe. This reflected the universal character of the document we were celebrating. Indeed, NDU believes in what Charles Malik believed, namely that values are not relative and human rights are universal. I will conclude by quoting what a former president of the Republic of Lebanon said of Malik. He said, "If I am to sum up Charles Malik's personality, Charles Malik the diplomat, Charles Malik the minister, Charles Malik the administrator who managed ministries, I would say Charles Malik the philosopher, because he truly was a philosopher. And when he entered into other domains, he did so from his philosophical understanding to accomplish his tasks. We are proud of Khalil Gibran. We are proud of Amin Rihani. We are proud of many Lebanese intellects. But in my opinion, Charles Malik is of this caliber, and even better, because he rolled up his sleeves and went into praxis." End of quotation. I welcome you all to NDU, though virtually, with the hope that we will have a chance to meet on campus in the future. And my wishes are that the coming 90 minutes would be positive and constructive. Thank you.
Thank you, President Father Pierre Najem. Mr. Berj Sitrakian, President of AGBU, it is my honor to welcome you live to this event. Thank you for joining us from New York. It must be very early for you now. Mr. Sitrakian, the floor is yours.
Reverend Pierre Najem, President of the University of Notre Dame, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, it is early in New York, and we have results of election pending, maybe for a couple of days. It is my honor and privilege to join you from New York City for the opening ceremony of the seminar dedicated to the late Dr. Charles Malik and the human rights legacy of Lebanon. I have a problem here. Ladies and gentlemen, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, known in general as AGBU and for many as Jam'iyya al-Khairiyya, is the largest Armenian organization founded in 1906 in Cairo, with a presence through its educational, cultural, social, and humanitarian programs, operating in more than 34 countries and headquartered in New York City. As its worldwide president, I welcome the initiative of AGBU Lebanon in joining the organization of the seminar with the University of Notre Dame, which, along with the US Library of Congress, houses the late Charles Malik's personal library, consisting of his writings and papers. I salute all of the guest speakers who will be addressing the various aspects of the contributions of the late Dr. Charles Malik in and beyond the borders of Lebanon to the entire world through his vision of universal principles of human rights. Charles Malik, the professor, the diplomat, the visionary, the mathematician, and the philosopher, is an icon who has been an inspiration to our entire generation, and his legacy will survive many generations to come. In addition, he was a man of faith and a theologian who believed in humankind and understood the concept of life and love, ethics, and morality. Charles Malik believed in Lebanon and the Lebanese, and during the course of his life, he served his country on the international scene like no other, in various capacities, as the country's representative to the ceremony of the signing of the United Nations Charter in San Francisco, the rapporteur of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, ambassador to the United States, professor and lecturer at Harvard and other prestigious universities and various international forums, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Education, and many other important functions. For me, as a Lebanese of Armenian descent, this seminar could not have been planned at a more opportune time. In Lebanon, over the past decades, we have been witnessing the slow but constant disintegration of all the ideals and principles that Charles Malik had advocated for our Lebanon and our society. He believed that Lebanon was a heaven for all, based on differences of opinion and belief. The recent internal strife within our society and the lack of goodwill of people to live together, which had been the country's symbol of coexistence and tolerance, are fading away. The national interest has yielded to the individual gains of power. I wonder whether we will see in the near future the rebirth of the Lebanon that Charles Malik and his contemporaries had envisioned. The existence and the future of minorities in the Middle East is presently at stake. Extremism and fundamentalism are becoming the new rules of social domination, far from the teachings of human rights and human values that we have inherited. The defense of human rights be ready only but to be applied to the realities of our daily life, both individually and collectively. Charles Malik invites us to act for this principle and not only to stand by. We wonder what is happening to the world and human society today. The most recent killings of innocent bystanders and individuals praying in churches in France and the terrorist attacks across Europe are of great concern to all of us. Unfortunately, such acts are claimed to be committed in the name of Allah the Great, the same God that we all pray to. The so-called Western civilization is trending toward an atheistic way of life, which is leading to its own social and human crisis. As we speak now, what is happening to the so-called civilized world, which is watching silently the perpetration of a second genocide in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh after about a century following the 1915 massacre of an entire population in the Ottoman Empire by the same perpetrators. A century apart, the world today is still remaining indifferent toward the plight of the first Christian nation, as if what is going on is a horror movie produced in Hollywood. Ladies and gentlemen, the world and humanity, and in particular, the United Nations and the so-called Western civilizations, and the values for which they stand are in danger. It is time to wake up. This seminar should mark an opportunity to be inspired by the teachings and acts of the late Charles Malik. We need to focus our efforts on catching up and fixing what is wrong in ourselves as humans who believe in the true teachings of God, the value of life, and the right to live with dignity and to enjoy basic rights. Without social justice, tolerance, and goodwill, these declarations will remain just ceremonial. I invite you all to join AGBU Lebanon on December 9, the anniversary of the commemoration of the United Nations International Day dedicated to the victims of genocide and the prevention of such crimes. Thank you for your participation today. Thank you to the University of Notre Dame. Thank you to AGBU Lebanon. Have a successful seminar. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Beige Sitrakian, for this welcoming word. The first panel is on Charles Malik, the person. The panel begins with a 10-minute recorded intervention by Charles Malik's son, Dr. Habib C. Malik, speaking of Charles Malik, the father.
Many know Charles Malik as a major contributor to the crafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Others know him as an international statesman who made his mark at the United Nations and elsewhere. Still others know him in the context of academia and the teaching of philosophy. Others still think of him in terms of the Christian ecumenical movement, especially in the 1960s and early 70s. All of these are very important features of Charles Malik. But for me, his only son, he was a father, first and foremost. And that is what I want to talk about right now. An important angle that is often overlooked. I was an only child, and I came 12 years into the marriage of my parents after a couple of miscarriages. And so I was the object of a lot of attention and a lot of love in our family. I always felt the presence of both my father and mother as loving parents who were around as I was growing up, and I was kind of oblivious to the fact that there were 100 other things preoccupying my father, definitely. But he was there for me and for my mother in a very seamless kind of way as far as my own formation and upbringing were concerned. My father imparted to me several things. I can say that the basics of my Christian faith come from my association with both my father and mother. And my father had always been an example for me of a person, on the one hand, with a towering intellect. I mean, I used to come and ask him questions in mathematics and physics. This was how he began his academic training in the sciences, the hard sciences, and he was quite excellent in these things. But I quickly discovered that very good mathematicians have difficulty teaching mathematics to novices like myself. So he would actually tell me, look at the problem, the answer is right there staring you in the face. And I'd say, if that were true, then I wouldn't be coming here to ask you these questions. Anyway, that was a kind of a frustrating experience for me, but it showed me a side of him, his tremendous confidence and knowledge when it came to the basic sciences. And then later on, when I grew up and became more aware of his philosophical acumen, that too impressed me a lot. But that was one feature. The other one was this same towering figure in my life and on the public stage was also a very humble and, in many respects, repentant Christian sinner. And that never failed to impress me as well. He was very aware of his personal shortcomings and foibles. And sometimes tears would well in his eyes, depending on the circumstances, whether it was mourning a loved one or remembering some, or actually during a church service, during prayers, he actually lived with the Bible. On a daily basis, he read in it, and he sat in various corners in our house and would read in it, and that also left a great impression on me. So the combination of a very active, very forceful personality, sought after by many people, plus this side of humility and spiritual brokenness, as it were, plus the attachment to Scripture and to the liturgy, the Orthodox liturgy, in his case, the Orthodox Church, are things that will never leave me. I mean, these are my impressions of the father I had. Another important feature is the many, many hours of discussions that took place in our home over the years as I was growing up, with friends, with colleagues, to the wee hours of the morning. I was like the fly on the wall, as it were, listening to these things, absorbing them, not fully understanding them at times, but later on coming back to them. Many of the ideas reverberated back in my head much later, when I began to kind of put things together and piece things together. So this was a very unique experience for me. In addition to that, or related to it, was the fact that he always emphasized the importance of learning and of reading and of the classics. And I was blessed with a group of friends in high school and then later on beyond that. We were all kind of like-minded in our pursuit of reading and of discussions of what we read. And so we spent summers devouring Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, of course in English translation, as well as Dickens and Shakespeare in the original, and talking about these ideas. And all of this, I would say, is thanks to the kind of home I grew up in and my father's influence, as it were. he left me with a number of interesting directives for my later life, full of wisdom in my opinion. But let me focus on two. He told me, stay away from politics. Politics, and he said two things about it. Politics is full of lies and is a waste of time. And in a sense, he was kind of expressing an aspect of tragedy in his own life, because he did devote a lot of time to politics at the expense of pure thought and delving even more deeply into philosophical issues as he would have liked to do. But on the other hand, Charles Malik is a more subtle and complex person. He did not advocate the ivory tower life of the professor. He, in fact, saw a great benefit in immersion in public life and in actual decision-making. And he saw how impoverished the pure ivory tower of detachment of the academy would be without that dimension. In a sense, it's very difficult to acquire a balance between these two. And he always felt from day one when he got into politics, and the letters he wrote back to the university where he had started his academic teaching career, the American University of Beirut, the letters he wrote back were that next year I'll be back, the year after I'll be back. He had the idea that this whole stint in politics was very temporary and passing, and he really belongs in academia. Well, it took a good 15 years before he did come back. He acquired a lot of experience. He saw, as I said, the limitations of pure ivory tower existence, but it was bittersweet because you have a limited time on this earth, and you would like to be able to devote it in ways that would satisfy your deepest cravings. And in his case, these were the life, as he called it, of the mind and the spirit. So that was one thing he told me, and I have actually taken him up on it. I have not entered politics in any official sense. I do keep track of what's going on. I write things sometimes and so forth, but I have no intention of devoting my career time to professional politics. The other thing he told me, which I've also kept in mind, but I have to say here, I have to admit that I have not been faithful to it. He said, don't be my posthumous secretary. In other words, he said, history will take care of me and my legacy. You go live your own life. Now, that's a loving father saying that to his son, wanting to liberate him from all of the shackles and the baggage that inevitably would befall a person like the son of Charles Malik. I have found over the years that it's impossible for me to stay away from doing at least some work to put this legacy together, to try and make it available, to organize it, and so on. And I still feel I haven't done anywhere near as much as I should. And of course, time is passing. But I have not been faithful to his desire for me not to be his posthumous secretary. I will not be his posthumous secretary in the technical sense, but I will certainly try to oversee the best management of the presentation of his legacy to the world and to history as much as I can. And I think I'm always kind of reminded, although the example I'm going to give now is much more stark. Franz Kafka told Max Brod, please burn all my unpublished manuscripts. And Max Brod, thankfully, didn't abide by that and ended up giving us the great writings that Kafka had left behind. Well, my father didn't actually tell me that, but for me to just walk away from that legacy would be, in my view, a kind of a betrayal of some duty I have somewhere. And it's not going to prevent me from living my own life. It's going to actually enrich my life. So these are some of the features that I wanted to share with you as the son of this remarkable man, Charles Malik, whom I love very much as my father.
Our next speaker is Dr. George F. Sabra, the president of the Near East School of Theology, NEST, and its professor of systematic theology. He is the author, editor, and translator of several books and articles in the fields of theology, ecumenism, Middle Eastern Christianity, and Christian-Muslim dialogue. He has also edited and published a number of works by Charles Malik. Dr. Sabra is delivering his word live from the Charles Malik Archive at NDU. The title of his talk is Charles Malik the Teacher. Professor Sabra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Nasrallah, and I thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. And as Mr. Nasrallah said, I'd like to say something about Charles Malik, the teacher. I was his student, an undergraduate student in the philosophy department of the American University of Beirut for several years. In fact, I was among the last group of students in the middle of the 1970s when the war in Lebanon broke out, and after which he stopped teaching due to the worsening security situation. Before being a diplomat and a famous international figure, Charles Malik was and always remained a teacher and an educator. He believed that the aim of learning and teaching was to seek the truth. And seeking the truth required that one immerse oneself in a cumulative tradition of over 5,000 years. True creativity and contribution, he believed, were impossible apart from this continuous and cumulative tradition, which he used to call with the very long name of the Greco-Roman, Christian, Islamic, Arabic, European, Western tradition. And this living tradition is transmitted through teaching and example from one generation to another. The most important event in the life of a thinker, wrote Malik, is the living connection that formed him and ignited in him the spark of reason and creativity. The important thing, he wrote, the important question is, from whom did you take the flame and who ignited you? Who ignited the spark in you? The most important question is, who is your teacher and what are your references? In a speech on the theories of education and learning in the modern age, Malik once said that the center of attention in teaching the arts and the humanities should be the teacher. Secure the brilliant teacher who has a vision and a mission, who is a master of his or her domain, passionate about his or her work, and all other needs are provided for. He did consider teaching, in his words, the noblest of all professions. Many teachers pass through our lives and in schools and at university, but we hardly remember them or retain anything lasting of what they taught us or how they impressed us. Not Charles Malik. If you've been in one of his classes, you never forget the experience or the man. I know this myself firsthand, but I've also repeatedly heard it from people who passed through Malik's classes over the years. Here's a testimony from one of his students, the late Hisham Sharabi, the Palestinian thinker and former professor of history at Georgetown University. Sharabi described his teacher, Charles Malik, in his autobiography saying, I quote, his style of communication was enchanting. He chose his words carefully, whether in Arabic or English, and spoke clearly, using complete sentences and with full confidence. His audience could not but listen to him attentively and in awe, even though they did not understand all that he said. His voice projected from the depth of his chest, and it rose and subsided dramatically, full of zeal and faith. That's why he had this amazing ability to make the hearer see and feel what he was describing or saying. Sharabi later broke away from Malik intellectually and also politically, and he criticized him severely, but he never denied the influence of his teacher on him in his early days. Malik used to place us, his students, before the ultimate and final questions without ignoring method, detail, and analysis. But he never allowed himself or his students to get lost in details and methodological analysis in such a way as to bind them to the essential questions, to blind them, to the essential questions. He confronted you, but not emotionally or poetically, with his fundamental thought that was really incarnated in his person. And so you were forced to decide and choose either with or against him. Either you agreed with him or you opposed him. And if you disagreed with him, he would confront you, and it would ignite in him a passion for discussion and argument. But he also respected you. There was no lukewarmness in the confrontation with Malik's thought. You accept or reject because what he confronted you with challenged you, disturbed you, and shook your complacency. He moved you, whether you agreed with him or not. He was passionate about the truth, sincere and committed in his teaching. The world-famous diplomat was never diplomatic when it came to the truth, to what mattered ultimately. He was sometimes seen as highly provocative and rough in his manner of conversing, but this was because he was utterly serious about the position he was trying to convey. Deep down, he was highly respectful of the opponent's point of view and of the opponent's persistence in carrying on the counter-argument. The lives of many of his students were transformed after coming into contact with him. His thought that was embodied in his person caused many young Lebanese and Arab students to put behind them their narrow nationalistic commitments and aspirations. After all, the 1930s and 40s, when Malik started teaching at AUB, was the high period of Arab and Pan-Syrian nationalisms. Malik's influence led people out of the narrow confines of nationalistic ideologies into the free realm of human universal thought and values. His thought embodied in his person and also led some to change their religious affiliations and others to change their confessional identities within Christianity. Still others were confirmed in their religious identities and traditions, but only after being reborn in them. His thought and his person were one. For thought for him was not a human luxury. It arose from being and was a witness to being. The true teacher was the one who experienced being in all that it has, of joy and pain and suffering, and not just the one who had a degree and read books and gathered information and organized it. Allow me to share with you an incident from the life of Charles Malik that expresses best what I'm trying to convey to you about his views about the true teacher. Malik was the chairperson of the Department of Philosophy at the American University of Beirut in the 1960s. On one of his trips abroad, a cousin of mine asked to see Dr. Malik in order to put in a few words for a friend who was applying for a teaching post at that department in Beirut. My cousin met with Malik and gave him a detailed account about the applicant. He had a doctorate in philosophy from a very prestigious US university. He had teaching experience. He had some respectable scholarly publications. In short, the applicant seemed to be very qualified intellectually and academically. Throughout the evening, Malik listened silently to the enumeration of the applicant's qualifications and achievements, as reported by my cousin. Finally, when there was nothing to add, Malik asked only one question. Has he suffered? Not really knowing Malik and the seriousness with which he viewed the nature and task of philosophy and the teaching of philosophy in the Middle East, my cousin was utterly bewildered. He had no idea what Malik was asking for or why he was asking it. He was speechless, and the evening ended rather awkwardly there. Has he suffered? Means, has he known need, brokenness, humility? Has he experienced rejection, despair, utter worthlessness, and so desired and fully recognized joy, hope, love, and truth? Has he been in hell so as to know what heaven is all about? Has he known abandonment and meaninglessness in life so as to be able to identify with those who have? The true teacher is the one who, in addition to his knowledge and scholarship, nay, at the heart of his knowledge and scholarship is the experience of true being, of active and suffering being. It is not all theory and skills, it is also character and mature personality. In a profound passage from the writings of the philosopher Nietzsche, and Malik was very fond of Nietzsche, the German philosopher addresses those who feel emptiness or lostness or a dying of the flame at some point of their lives. And Nietzsche writes, but how do we find ourselves again? How can the human being know himself? The young soul may look back at its life and ask, what have you really loved until now? What has pulled you up? What has dominated you and at the same time gladdened you? Put these venerable things before you. Perhaps they will give you your true essence. For your true essence does not lie hidden deep in you, but immeasurably high above you. To be sure, there are other means to find yourself. But, says Nietzsche, I know none better than to recall your teachers. And when I ask myself, what have I loved truly and what has pulled me up and drawn me higher? What has dominated me and at the same time gladdened me? Who ignited the spark in me? I think of my teacher, Charles Malik. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sabra, for igniting in us something from Charles Malik. Our next speaker on this panel is Reverend Dr. Habib Badr. Reverend Badr has been teaching church history at the Near East School of Theology in Beirut, Lebanon, since 1980, and has served as a pastor of the National Evangelical Church of Beirut since. His areas of interest and research are American Protestant missionary activity in the Near East, and he has edited and published a massive book under the title Christianity, A History in the Middle East. The title of his talk is Charles Malik, the Mentor. Reverend Badr, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It gives me pleasure to present this short testimony on Charles Malik. Charles Malik, the person. And I've entitled my presentation, as Mr. Nasrallah said, Charles Malik, the Mentor. By saying that Malik was my mentor, I mean that he was the person who most influenced, guided, and shaped my spiritual, my cultural, and my intellectual formation. And he still does till this very day. My early encounter with the person of Charles Malik occurred during my childhood, for I too am related to Charles Malik, being that his late wife, Eva, is my late father's sister. So for years and years, Malik, the mentor, was for me Uncle Charles. The first major mentoring experience I had was given through the tradition that Uncle Charles, or that Dr. Malik, introduced into our family on Christmas Eve. Each December 24th, as our extended family gathered to celebrate by caroling, by enjoying good food and exchanging gifts, and before all else, Uncle Charles would read to us from the Bible the nativity accounts from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And only after that reading, our festivities could begin. Later in life, I discovered the love affair, quote unquote, if we may so phrase it, and as my cousin Habib Malik has spoken, I discovered the love affair that existed between Charles Malik and the Holy Scriptures, and which itself should be a subject of a conference. It was indeed unusual, for example, that a Greek Orthodox Christian would be elected vice president of the United Bible Societies, the International Bible Society, and would reflect so deeply on his intimate relationship with the Bible as the Word of God. Here, I just want to impress upon you what he impressed upon me and our whole family, most of whom are Protestant by affiliation, and therefore quite familiar and comfortable with the centrality of the Bible in the life and piety of the faithful. What Dr. Malik, at that time Uncle Charles, planted in us and in our hearts and souls as children was the importance of incorporating the Word of God into our lives, and more significantly, of what one might call the anamnesis effect, that is, the regenerating or the re-presencing effect that the Word of God can have in our lives as a family and as individuals, that regenerates us and that helps us. And this, of course, is outside the liturgical life of the church on Sundays. Malik himself, as Habib has testified, and as we learned from his memoirs later, put this principle into practice at crucial and difficult moments in his own life. And Tony Nasrallah can elaborate on this point later if there is time, of how the Bible played a role in Malik's existential relationship to God. The second major mentoring experience I had was again during my childhood and teen years, when the Maliks would return from the United States to Lebanon and would bring along gifts for us. In addition to toys, my special gift was always long play records of classical music. I especially remember Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and his Fifth Piano Concerto. This was Malik's way of reminding me of my need as a young man to immerse myself into the great tradition of Western and world culture by not only reading the classics, again, as Habib has mentioned, but also by listening to music and contemplating the artistic and creative achievements, especially of Europe. Malik never failed to ask me every time he saw me whether I was practicing my piano or if I was reading the classics. Again, as Dr. Sabra has mentioned, this was his way of pressing upon us the need to be part of that cumulative tradition of world classical culture. My third experience happened in the convent of St. Elias, Marlies, in Shwer, Mount Lebanon. When Malik took some of us kids with him to attend the liturgy at the church there, which was led at the time by the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, Elias IV. I remember not being so attentive to the sermon of his beatitude, but much more impressed by the tears that flowed down on Malik's cheeks as he recited the Nicene Creed after the sermon, and we saw a photograph of that. The fact that this great diplomat and politician, the great philosopher and university professor, Uncle Charles, the giant man we knew, would shed a tear when reciting the creed greatly affected me. Malik's great devotion to the Church of Christ, and especially to its Orthodox Byzantine liturgy, made me realize that the roots of Malik's greatness lie as much in his simple faith in Christ as in his sophisticated knowledge of the world and its cultures. That experience humbled me a great deal and taught me much about the relationship between faith and culture. Studying with Malik later and reading his writings, of course, made me better understand the roots of this fantastic connection, this symphonia, I should say, between the man of faith and the man of diplomacy, politics, and reason. And this becomes especially meaningful when one realizes that Malik, as his son has said, started out his life as a mathematician and scientist, and not as a philosopher or a politician. Now, naturally, the greatest of the mentoring experiences came after I became Charles Malik's student at the American University of Beirut. I cannot recount here all the great moments in and outside class when Malik did or said something to me personally or to the class that made a lasting impression on me, thus turning it into a mentoring moment, as I've called it. In the remaining time, I will only list two such moments. The first was his explanation of Aristotle's concept of nature, physis, in light of Edmund Husserl's phenomenological theory of knowledge. Malik taught me to think realistically, precisely, and properly by allowing all things, all phenomena, that is, all matters outside of me, to speak for themselves. Malik trained me never to depend on impressions or pre-formulated ideas I may have about anything as I attempt to understand it. But be it my own Protestantism, which I came to understand and appreciate so much more because of him, or be it any other Christian way of thinking, especially the Catholic and the Orthodox ways, or be it even Judaism or Islam, or whatever else I am studying or evaluating or judging or appreciating. In my view, this realistic phenomenological approach was the key to Malik's own ecumenical stance towards all Christian and non-Christian ideas and religions. Malik taught me to think and see phenomena scientifically. I mean, that is to understand the nature of things, طبيعة الأشياء, as he called it, in a realistic and clear way. When considering all matters, whether it is reading or analyzing a momentous political or historical event, preaching a sermon, or writing a simple term paper, Malik always stressed that one should think in a clear manner, use correct and precise language to describe it, and express oneself in clear concepts. Malik used to correct my commas and my dots and my points in my term papers. I cannot claim I always lived up to this high standard that he set for me, but I can say that whatever good came out of my mouth and my mind, I owe to his mentoring. Finally, the last moment I want to mention here is what I have named 3 years ago, the Nietzsche experience. I've spoken at length on this issue in a talk I gave at NDU in March 2016, and some of you were there. I refer you to it if you would like more details. Here, I just summarize what I said back then. When considering the text of Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in an ethics course at AUB, Malik, as I mentioned, being himself steeply versed in and familiar with the Bible, Malik drew our attention to so many instances where Nietzsche, who was the son of a Protestant Lutheran clergyman, where Nietzsche refers to biblical texts or ideas in a hidden and inverted manner. Malik would make very profound observations and comments on the apparent and hidden meaning of many such passages in Nietzsche. He would make us see that the new religion or the new set of values that Nietzsche wanted to promote, what Nietzsche termed the transvaluation of all values, was indeed quite similar, according to Malik, to the values that Christ himself preached and taught. Malik saw Nietzsche's Superman, the Übermensch, or the Overman, whom Nietzsche imagined would come in the future, to be more similar to Christ the man than Nietzsche would ever have been willing to admit. For Malik and for me, therefore, the humanity of Christ can be much better understood if one truly grasps the essence of the concept of the Superman in Nietzsche. Again and again, Malik would point to the competition. Sometimes Malik would even use the term envy between Nietzsche's Superman and the human Christ. In my presentation in 2016, I cited examples of how Malik made us to see in Nietzsche's Zarathustra many deep and great insights into the nature of Christianity itself, and how that greatly mentored me and opened my eyes to my biblically based faith. Charles Malik mentored me by helping me to better understand what it meant to contribute towards this higher history that Nietzsche aimed at and tried to bring about, as well as to do my own share in preparing for that higher man, for that higher human being that Nietzsche envisioned. This forcefully inspired me to take up the calling to be a servant and minister in the Church of Christ to men and to women and to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Habib Badr, for this wonderful intervention, which is at once personal, philosophical, and spiritual. The floor is now open to a limited number of questions, Q&A. Perhaps we can take 3 questions. The way this will happen is as such. If you have a question, just type your name with the word question, and the first 3 to sign up will be given floor to ask. Roger Priest, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you for the inspiring lectures. It's just been very heartwarming. Greetings from London, from the Royal Foundation of St. Catherine. And I was just thinking and reflecting in our current climate, the wisdom of a theologian, philosopher, and politician. I wonder what the words would be given to our current political discourse, both in America or the UK or the Lebanon. What would his word be for today, do you think, any of the panelists?
If you can postpone your question till the next panel, I think it would be more timely, because the next panel is about Charles Malik, the diplomat. We will register this question, and I'm sure Professor Moin and His Excellency Ambassador Al-Khazin will keep this in mind. But thank you for your question. There is room for further questions if you wish. Mr. Vahey, and then Ms. Nahla Basha.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've noticed a lot of relationship between philosophy, religion, and politics, considering the structure of Lebanon today and how the parliament is divided. How much influence do the religious bodies have when it comes to decision making?
Is the question to anyone specific of the panelists?
No, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, perhaps I will postpone it again till the next panel, because it's in the domain of the next panel. I think it makes better sense after we listen to both Professors Khazin and Moin. Dr. Nahla Basha.
Thank you, Dr. Nasrallah. I am very much interested in this panel discussion, and I have joined today to listen more about Charles Malik, who, if I can say, I'm also related to. But I did not know the man's philosophy. I met him when I was 17 years old, coming from Australia, and I walked up the stairs at AUB to his office, and I wanted to ask him, how should I apply to AUB? Well, anyway, that was a long time ago. My 2 questions are, I don't know if they are easy or not. I'm an English teacher, but I love philosophy. The first question is, I know that he read a lot of philosophy, but who do you think is his favorite, if I can say favorite, sorry for the mundane term, his favorite philosopher, and why? That's number 1. Number 2, how does he resolve being a scientist on the one hand and being a religious person on the other. I think there is always this view that when you are very religious, it's based on faith, whereas science, it's based on fact and experiment. But there's always been a debate between the two. How would he resolve this as a person, or didn't he resolve it? Or what would he say if the scientist of himself told himself that the world, like Darwin, went through evolution? And then how would he resolve the question of the creation by God? This has always fascinated me. And I don't know if there is anyone there that can help me out with that second question. I think it also needs a panel, I suppose. All right. And Tony, maybe you, or if someone else could just very simply try to answer this. Thank you.
I think Professor Sabra will have something to say on that.
Okay. I thank him for that.
It's highlighted.
Yes, I just happen to have the book that Malik wrote in Arabic about his really his intellectual autobiography, so to speak. And yes, he always mentioned some philosophers who he thought were the greatest. Well, I can't find it here, but definitely Aristotle.
Yes, Aristotle.
Here, yes, Aristotle, he would mention Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
Kant and Hegel and Heidegger, Augustine. Now, he had a ranking of them, but I think you could really reduce them to symbolically to Aristotle and Aquinas, because one represents the Greek rational scientific outlook, the mind, and the other represents faith and religion and revelation. And all his life, he was really trying to bring the two together. And he believed that there could be no contradiction between faith and reason, between revelation and reason, provided, of course, reason knew its limits, and provided that revelation does not, or faith does not transgress into domains that are not its own. Now, he had a lot of critique of evolutionism, not so much the theory of evolution as a scientific theory, but the application of the idea of evolution to everything in life. He critiqued that, but he would have really had no problem with the scientific account of how life evolved and there being a creator, because the two are not really exclusive of each other.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabra.
Reverend Badr, might you have anything to say?
Sorry, Dr. Nasrallah?
I'm checking if Reverend Badr wishes to add anything. And
I would have said the same things as Dr. Sabra, and to say that in his early life, one of his attractions to go and study in the United States under Alfred North Whitehead was his desire to find a way to God that is also in line with reasoning and science. And that is, at first, he thought Alfred North Whitehead could give him the answer. Eventually, he went beyond him. But at first, your question is actually his question as well.
Thank you. By this, we will have to end the first panel. I know there are other requests for questions, but unfortunately, we're running short of time. We still have about half an hour or even less for the second panel. So we shall begin immediately with the second panel without taking a break. So welcome back again to the symposium, Charles Malik, the Human Rights Legacy of Lebanon. Panel 2 begins with a short documentary film on Charles Malik, the diplomat. The film was produced by AGBU.
The General Assembly, considering that knowledge and understanding of the aims and activities of the United Nations are essential in promoting and assuring general interest and popular support of its work, recommends to all member governments that they take measures at the earliest possible date to encourage the teaching of the United Nations Charter and the purposes and principles, the structure, background and activities.
Charles Malik was a Lebanese philosopher and diplomat. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in mathematics and physics from the American University of Beirut, Malik took his first job teaching at the university for 2 years. He later applied for graduate studies at Harvard by corresponding with the famous philosophy professor Alfred North Whitehead. In the letter, which was not void of humor, Malik, admitting he was nearly penniless, wrote, "I'm applying by this letter for a position in your kitchen or garden. If you knew with what absolute enthusiasm and earnestness I tender this application, I am sure you would not hesitate an instant in sympathizing with it, lest you be made up wholly of flint." Malik did indeed go to Harvard, where he excelled in the philosophy graduate program. He received a traveling scholarship that enabled him to spend 14 months in Germany, attending the lectures of the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who at the time was unknown in America. Malik later recalled, "There were 37 of us from all over the world. We were all handpicked by Heidegger himself." After receiving his PhD from Harvard, Malik returned to Lebanon to teach and founded the philosophy department at the American University of Beirut. The president of the newly independent Lebanon invited Malik to represent his country at the event of the founding of the United Nations and to be Lebanon's ambassador at the United States. After a lot of hesitation, Malik accepted the offer, assuring himself that it would only be a temporary affair. Not yet 40, Malik was one of the youngest delegates to sign the United Nations Charter. Within a short while, Malik assumed productive involvement in various committees in the United Nations. His eloquent speeches and his mastery of the English language no doubt played an important role in his diplomatic success. Malik often played many roles in the United Nations simultaneously. By the fall of 1948, for example, he was the president of the Economic and Social Council, chairman of the UN's Social, Humanitarian and Cultural Affairs Committee, and the rapporteur of the Commissions on Human Rights, over and above being Lebanon's ambassador to the United States. While diplomats arrived in their extravagant cars to UN meetings, Malik was often seen walking to such international assemblies. His role in the Human Rights Committee was without any doubt significant. Except for a few minor changes, the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by Charles Malik. He also authored Article 18 on freedom of thought, conscience and religion, Article 16 on the family, and promoted the universality of human rights. Malik was one of the early voices to warn the West about the dangers of Soviet communism. He delivered extensive speeches at the UN about its threat.
Well, I read Marx and I read Lenin and I read Stalin rather carefully, as much of them as I could. And I do not believe that these men honestly believe that there can be peace until they have communized the whole world.
After a decade of diplomacy in America, Malik returned to Lebanon, where he was soon appointed as Lebanon's foreign minister and remained in this capacity for 2 years. He then went back to America, where he was elected in 1958 as president of the United Nations General Assembly for 1 year.
Dr. Charles Malik of the Lebanon, having obtained the required majority, has been elected president of the 13th regular session of the General Assembly. In extending my cordial congratulations to Dr. Malik, I have the honor to invite him to take the chair at the rostrum.
When the Lebanese Civil War erupted in 1975, Malik saw himself once more in politics, trying to rescue the newly torn country. His fear was that the freedom that the Lebanese enjoyed was at risk. For him, Lebanon means freedom, and without freedom, there is no Lebanon, except by name. Malik was invited in 1972 by Encyclopedia Britannica to write an article on diplomacy, which was published as the entry on diplomacy in the 1973 Encyclopedia edition. His legacy is well documented in a diary of 34,000 pages spanning 50 years. Through Charles Malik's own pen, these diaries attest to the formation of many historical decisions. Great parts of his rich personal archive are housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And another great archive is also found at Notre University-Louaize in Lebanon.
Our first speaker on this panel is His Excellency Ambassador Farid Al-Khazin. Dr. Farid Al-Khazin has been the ambassador of Lebanon to the Holy See for the past 2 years. Prior to that, he served as a lawmaker in the Lebanese parliament for more than a decade. And he comes from an academic background where he was the chairperson of the Political Studies Department at the American University of Beirut. Dr. Al-Khazin shares with Charles Malik the combining of academia with diplomacy.
Okay.
The title of Ambassador Al-Khazin's talk is Against the Current, Charles Malik, the Philosopher Diplomat. Ambassador Al-Khazin joins us from Rome. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this conference on a apparently fateful day, election day, for the United States and for the rest of the world. Charles Malik's ultimate legacy lies in three interlocking endeavors: history making, history writing, and history interpreting, all embodied in the making of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its aftermath. Malik, no doubt, was conscious of the three missions he pursued relentlessly. In all three facets of history, one question has particular relevance: that of Malik, the diplomat philosopher, or the philosopher diplomat. Malik's wisdom, principles, decisions, and actions exemplified these attributes, which helped generate the world's most significant intellectual legal document since the end of the Second World War, the Declaration of Equal Rights for Humankind. Adopted, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Adopted or accepted today by many member states of the United Nations. And this by itself is an unprecedented international body which survived crises and challenges and has recently celebrated its 75th anniversary. Charles Malik's deeply rooted beliefs and convictions rested on an international order made up of free and independent state entities. This was a conviction, an assumption, or a benchmark that one sees across Malik's writings. In all, this is what he writes. In all species of diplomacy, writes Malik, the elements of freedom, independence, rationality, mutual respect, equality, and the presence of some end in view, which is at least fully understood by two parties, if not wholly agreed upon between them, are clearly operative. This is really a fundamental aspect of Malik's assumptions about the international order. And that is not all. For Malik, and I quote Malik, deeper than economic, social, and political developments are movements of the spirit and changes in fundamental attitudes, and the extent to which the diplomat senses and appreciates these deeper realms measures his own intellectual, spiritual culture. And I believe this is what mattered most for Malik, and it mattered most then and now. Malik's entry ticket to diplomacy, both in Washington and the United Nations, since its founding in the San Francisco Conference, was a tiny country in an emerging international order in the aftermath of two devastating world wars. Unlike the aftermath of the First World War and the predominant concern, and when the predominant concern hinged on the prevention of armed conflict, after the Second World War, concern went well beyond stability and peaceful relations between nations to relations among free individuals. All the more so when, according to Malik, international relations are always going to be more or less the same, characterized at times by murkiness, secrecy, and intrigue, and there will never be perpetual peace. Quoting Malik, end of quote. In UN deliberations and discussions in specialized commissions or committees, notably one chaired by Malik, before reaching vote in the General Assembly, Malik, the philosopher diplomat, prevailed, buttressed by leadership skills and resolve, next to an enlightened representative of the global power, Mrs. Roosevelt, France's eminent jurist, René Cassin, and China's Chiang, thinker and philosopher. In the game of power politics, that is the balancing of power between states vying for influence, hegemony, and expansionism, if need be, Malik's turf was that of the balance of power in the theological and intellectual realm, a craft he mastered irrespective of diplomatic practice. Most visible in this regard was the ability to draw the line between mission and function, and the implementation that should follow. I don't have time to elaborate on the distinction between mission and functions, which Malik talks about in some detail. In Malik's words, two contrasting theories about the character of the diplomatic function: the theory of idealism and the theory of realism. Malik unambiguously opted for idealism while not dismissing realism, the realpolitik practice from Richelieu and Bismarck to the present. But for Malik, raison du philosophe superseded the raison d'etat. Indeed, Malik's interest in politics and diplomacy is only temporary, as alluded to by Habib Malik when he told him to stay away from politics. Indeed, Charles Malik said, "My heart lies definitely in teaching and speculation, to which I shall return as soon as I find my mission reasonably fulfilled. And the mission came to fruition in 1948. In the mid-50s, Malik embarked on another task as foreign minister of Lebanon at a time of acute polarization, at the height of the Cold War in the Middle East, and when Nasserism peaked in Arab politics. A defiant government official, Malik stood for Lebanon's independence, referring to major powers, which Malik calls international balancers. He observed, I'm quoting now, they have no principles, no roots, no values to guide their footsteps, no deposit of tradition to treasure and deepen, which they would die for if necessary. The important thing is to balance the given factors by any means and any cost. End of quote. The timing of the Universal Declaration seemed favorable. That is, before Cold War confrontation intensified, and when newly independent states were in their formative years, while post-war ideologies were still in the making, and especially when liberalism had a breathing space, both in East and West. The Universal Declaration received unanimous vote in the General Assembly, with only a few abstentions. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Palestine went through war and partition in May 48. Malik stood up to Palestinian rights and the legitimate aspirations for statehood. But his early warning signals about Israel's expansionism went unheeded. He took a stand on these issues without the seal of approval or ideological legitimacy bestowed by Arab leaders or regimes. Seasonal political correctness never preoccupied Malik. The free man's convictions led his way. Since Malik's UN days, the international order has undergone drastic transformation. The Cold War ended peacefully in 1989, but history did not end a la Fukuyama, as is well known, nor did liberalism prevail. In fact, conflicts between states and cultural traditions gained momentum in an age beset by contradictory dynamics of change, globalization and retrenchment, both within and between states. Although divisive forces took on various forms, rights embodied in the Universal Declaration were maintained both in theory and practice, despite anomalies and setbacks. The challenge continues, of course, all the more so when, according to Malik, I'm quoting, you are not free not to be free and not to decide, and both the choosing and the deciding must be free. Before the end of warfare in Lebanon, Pope St. John Paul II proclaimed in 1989 Lebanon's mission. In his words, Lebanon is more than a country, it is a message of freedom and an example of pluralism for East and West. That mission was embodied in Malik's contribution to the making of the Universal Declaration, a mission that Lebanon should uphold, despite crisis and hardships that the country faces today. And in the same vein, President Michel Aoun is seeking to establish in Lebanon the UN Academy for Human Encounters and Dialogue. Malik, the believer, committed to values of openness and dialogue, went a step further in what I call spiritual diplomacy, thus leaving a mark on the ecumenical movement. He was involved in bringing together Pope Paul VI and Greek Orthodox Patriarch Athenagoras I of Constantinople. The Jerusalem encounter between the two prelates in January 1964 on the Mount of Olives broke the silence of centuries toward healing the schism of the 11th century between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. A double reminder of the fact of separation and of the fact of unity. This ecclesial embrace was reaffirmed by Pope Francis in a commemoration ceremony in the Holy Land on its 50th anniversary in 2014. For years, Malik was also actively involved with the evangelicals throughout the world. He was from 66 to 72. And as a main speaker for the inauguration of the Billy Graham Center in 1980 at Wheaton College in the United States, Malik warned of the danger of anti-intellectualism besetting American evangelical Christianity. The problem, Malik explained, is not only to win souls, but to save minds. Ecumenism was Malik's perpetual concern, driven by faith and biblically inspired motivation, as was alluded to in the previous panel. While seeking to build bridges between Eastern and Western Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, he retained admiration and respect in all religious traditions. If the 19th century generated the new ideologies and nationalism, the 20th century presented another alternative for mankind, that of being free in spirit and mind, and that of having rights, irrespective of nation, culture, creed, or political leaning. Malik was instrumental in this quest. In diplomacy, higher education, and philosophy, Malik has given Lebanon and
Ambassador Khazin,
to
I'm sorry to be interrupting you, but we are running short of time because we still have.
I'm done. This is our last. I'm done. Just 1 minute. In the end, Lebanon has left its mark on the world scene in recent decades. This began with Khalil Gibran's Prophet, continued with Charles Malik's achievements and legacy, and transcended far beyond earthly matters with Saint Sherbet. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Al-Khazin. We move now to our next speaker on this panel, and sorry if we shall go maybe a few minutes overboard. Professor Samuel Moyn, who is both a professor of jurisprudence and a professor of history at Yale University. Professor Moyn has authored several books in the field of European intellectual history and human rights history, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, in which he refers extensively to Charles Malik. Professor Moyn's most recent books are Christian Human Rights and Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World. Professor Moyn is currently working on a book on the origins of humane war. The title of his talk today is Charles Malik and Personalist Human Rights. Professor Moyn joins us live from the United States. Professor Samuel Moyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Tony Nasrallah for inviting me. I'm going to begin with 3 provisos. The first is that as an American citizen, I have not slept last night as I monitored the election. The second is that there are only 2 minutes left in the seminar. And so I'm going to radically abbreviate what I was going to say, just because many of us cannot stay for very much longer. The third is that I don't hold myself out as an expert on Charles Malik, more on the broader history of human rights. And that's where I want to begin. I'm just going to make 4 very quick comments about the professional historiography that has taken up Charles Malik really in the past 20 years. It's not that he had been entirely forgotten, as many of you have said, amongst those who had personal connections to him. But in the year 2000, in the study of human rights, he was almost unknown. And it was really in the last 20 years when the origins of the Universal Declaration were re-examined that Malik became famous again. And he's been, I think, more intensively studied in the last 2 decades than ever before. And I just want to say 4 things about what I have learned from reading what scholars have written about him in the Anglophone literature. The first concerns his philosophical origins. This has already been mentioned that not just his time in Germany, but his a brief stint at Harvard University was extremely important. But what I think many scholars have now emphasized is that even more than Alfred North Whitehead, on whom he wrote, it was the Harvard scholar and philosopher William Ernest Hocking who exerted extraordinary influence on Malik in the 1930s. Hocking was closely related to Christian missionary activity and devised in response to the Great Depression, a vision of a post-liberal Christian perfectionism. And I believe that was extremely influential for Malik as he came into his own way of thinking. The second remark is going to be about the vision of human rights and the framework for them that Malik embraced in the 1940s, along with many other Christians. Because while there had been many visions of human rights in modern history and perhaps even before, there was an extraordinary vogue of what I will call personalist human rights in the 1940s, as many, especially many Christians, embraced human rights as a third way alternative in between the old liberalism of the 19th century and the new totalitarianism of the 20th century. And Malik is an excellent example of this because of his rejection of what he called, in his words, the spiritless secularism of the totalitarian ideologies, not just fascism, but communism, but also viewing the concept of the person, the human person, as a better notion than the liberal individual. And not the least of, I believe, his effects on the Universal Declaration was to make the human person prominent to it. My third remark is about the kind of Christianity that for Malik provided a framework for himself thinking about human rights. When scholars have gathered many of the statements he made, they're quite striking in this regard. I'll just read a couple of those. To begin with, he argued that the deepest foundation of the significance of the present international activity in the field of human rights is that it is a faint echo of a spiritual reaction against the modern dissolution of the human soul. We are trying, in effect, knowingly or unknowingly, to go back to the Platonic Christian tradition. So what's interesting to me in that citation is that human rights were, in a sense, not the most important thing for Malik because they reflected an attempt that was far broader and that was more important for him to return to that older tradition. Even more strikingly, in the very year of 1948 that he was doing such important work in drafting the UDHR, he wrote that human rights were not going to be enough to allow for the restoration of the Platonic Christian tradition that he valued. Again, listen to his words. Having lost his hold on God, or more accurately, having blinded himself to God's constant hold on him, modern man seeks for his rights elsewhere in vain. It's as if, unless human rights were more than a proxy for a return to a tradition that valued the human person, they themselves would not be worth pursuing. That leads me to my fourth and last point in my very abbreviated remarks, which concern how the rest of history around human rights made it difficult to sustain Malik's own way of thinking about them. It wasn't just his stern Cold War anti-communism that in many communities left him more marginal than he had been in the 1940s, because after all, with the changes in the United Nations and the changes in generations after the 1940s, human rights became something different than they had been when Malik had such an opportunity to affect them. He, as other speakers have mentioned, placed the right to think and believe at the center of human rights. And of course, himself, given his interest in missionary conversion, was almost single-handedly responsible for embedding the notion of the right to change religion in the Universal Declaration. But as the 1950s and 60s passed and decolonization changed human rights, some themes that Malik thought were less important, like collective self-determination and distributional issues, had a big effect on what human rights came to mean to many audiences. The same was true of generational change. And historians have documented how in the 1960s, Malik was quite skeptical of youth revolts that tended to make human rights more mobilizational, and in some of their articulations more countercultural. So all of that, I think, makes Malik a figure of his time, although of course his vision is there for anyone to retrieve if it is plausible to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moyne, for this thoughtful and profound word. We appreciate your joining us in spite of all the challenges and the extra time we required of you and having you waiting so long. If we may take the two previous questions, we will not have room for further questions. The question from Reverend Roger Priest and from Mr. Vahé Artinian. Could you voice out your question again, Roger Priest, if you are still with us?
Yes, it was really about what would Charles Malik's word be today? And I'm thinking in the current political discourse that we see increased polarization and change in the way things are going. And maybe in the United States, what might his comment be to the two contendants for the presidency, I wonder.
And Mr. Vahé Artinian, would you voice out your question now, and then we'll hear the answers?
May I change my question, because
Sure.
I was asking about Lebanon.
By all means, you may change.
The professor is an American and he spoke about human rights. So I would ask him, how would he advise the Armenians worldwide currently facing a human rights tragedy, being bombed by phosphorus bombs of Azerbaijan and drones, and killing civilians and school kids and destroying a whole area of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is Artsakh? Thank you.
Floor to His Excellency Ambassador Al-Khazin and Professor Samuel Moyne. Perhaps we begin with Professor Samuel Moyne, if you have something to say.
I don't have an expert comment on that question, which is obviously pointing to a horrendous failure of the international community. But it's as a citizen, I will say that the interventions like Libya have in 2011 have left some great powers less interested in organizing help for civilians in wartime. And of course, Donald Trump's presidency has been anti-interventionist in my country, which means it's very hard to understand what can be done in diplomatically. But that's why I would love for my fellow panelists to answer this question.
Ambassador Al-Khazin.
I don't think I heard Father Pierce's question properly. But anyway, I can comment on what Mr. Artini also had to say. Now, conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, unfortunately, this is the post-Cold War era with its baggage of conflict that appears here and there, and at a time when the region, I mean the Middle East, is beset by conflict, armed conflict, different kinds of conflicts, and when these linkages are there today between Middle East, that is all the elements, in other words, all the elements of instability in the region, unfortunately, in the Middle East, are mobilized. And I think there is some linkage, and I'm sure there is some linkage with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, at a time when the US has opted for a different behavior and discourse, and certainly the international order that we live in is not helping. I need a lot of time to explain this, but unlike the international order of the 40s that produced the Universal Declaration.
Thank you, Professor Al-Khazin, Ambassador Professor Al-Khazin, and Professor Samuel Moyne. By this, we conclude the second panel. I will still ask of you 2 more minutes that I give my concluding remarks in brief, if you wish. Otherwise, of course, you may leave. So before concluding with my remarks, I wish to thank Mrs. Mireille Khana Merian. Not only was she the one who suggested this symposium, but she was also instrumental in implementing it. I also wish to thank Ms. Arine Ghazarian from AGBU, who dealt with various challenges in the most professional manner. Mr. Gerard Toufingjian, President of AGBU Lebanon, Ms. Leia Iknadosian, and Ms. Liana Melkonian, as well as, of course, Mr. President Berj Setrakian of AGBU, and our President of NDU, President Pierre Najem. So from NDU, we start by thanking President Najem, but then Ms. Pauline Nuhra, Mrs. Emma Shakar, Mr. Andre Fahad, Mrs. Maggie Sauma Abiframe, Dr. Fawzi Baroud, Mr. Nazir Khalil, and Mr. Azar Basil. And I extend, of course, my gratitude to Dr. Habib C. Malik. This symposium has shed light on Charles Malik, the person, which is an aspect often overshadowed by Malik, the philosopher and the player on the public arena. Charles Malik is first and foremost a father, according to his son, and a teacher, according to Professor Sabra, and no less than a mentor to Reverend Badr. We have seen Malik as an authority on diplomacy on an Encyclopedia Britannica level, not dwelling on ivory towers, and we have seen him as a great contributor to personal human rights. Charles Malik is the cornerstone of human rights legacy of Lebanon. From the archives of Charles Malik at Notre Dame University, I thank our 4 speakers and our audience from all over the globe. And by this, we end the conference.
Thank you.